I think anyone who sets out to develop Hegel's thought within the ambit of a 30-minute lecture really deserves all he gets. Suits for libel, perhaps even actions by surviving members of the Hegel clan, if there are any. Sometimes when students ask for a quite sharp distinction between the classical and romantic worldviews, I've said, half seriously, to recall that Aristotle's will calls for him to be buried next to his wife, and Hegel's will calls for him to be buried next to Fichte. Now, I'm not quite sure that conveys all of the distinctions I'd want to make between classicism and romanticism, but it certainly is an introduction to some of the distinctions that I would offer in this lecture. Hegel was born in 1770 to a middle-class family in Stuttgart. His early education featured the classics and was preparatory for theological studies, which in time proved boring to him. His record at Tübingen's Stift Theological Seminary was unremarkable, his record indicating that he was judged to be of, quote, middling industry and knowledge, close quote. He roomed with two young men who would distinguish themselves in future years, the poet Hölderlin, whose two-volume Hyperion is a classic in German literature, and Schelling, who will be associated with Hegel in years to come, and who figured importantly in what came to be known as German idealism. Now, the academic world of Germany, and of Tübingen especially, was in turmoil as a result of the French Revolution and the ideas surrounding it and arising from it. Hegel, in 1792, is ranked by his fellow students as one of the great defenders of freedom. It's a period of reform, of rejection of the past, and Hegel is among that intellectual elite, aware of the debts to the past, but aware as well of the changing conditions of the world, a political world the Greeks could not have anticipated, and which conventional science cannot even address, as Hegel sees things. Now, there's so much that's elusive in Hegel that it's best to let him state what he takes to be his mission. The briefest expression of this is provided in the preface he wrote for his monumental Phenomenology of Mind. Here's the quote. "The systematic development of truth in scientific form can alone be the true shape in which truth exists. To help bring philosophy nearer to the form of science, that goal where it can lay aside the name of love of knowledge and be actual knowledge, that is what I have set before me," close quote. A noble ambition. What Hegel shares with his immediate predecessors, and indeed with Romanticism at large, is the judgment that science, as traditionally understood, as perfected in the age of Newton, is a quite narrow, one-sided, misleading affair. That if science is going to stay at the level of mechanistic explanation and the particularization of the complex into some reduced non-reality, then what science will be capable of explaining is very little indeed. It's just going to be an exercise in the vindication of its own flawed and simplistic methods. The subject of truth itself is what has real being, and real in the sense of nothing being added or modified by peculiar or merely conventional modes of analysis. The possession of such truth is in the form, Hegel says, of a concept, in German ein Begriff. Writing again in his preface, he says, "Scientific knowledge, Erkennen, demands that one give himself to the life of the object, or to say the same thing in different words, that one have before oneself and express in speech the inner necessity of this object," close quote. Descartes' own revolution was never lost on Hegel. In his lectures on the history of philosophy, Hegel declared Descartes to be the thinker who revived, after 1,000 years of neglect, the very foundations on which philosophy is based. As understood by Hegel, the achievement of Descartes was to recognize that knowledge in all of its forms is but, quote, the unity of thought and being, close quote. His starting point is universal doubt, says Hegel, and thus serves as, quote, an absolute beginning. Thus Descartes, and here again are the words of Hegel on Descartes, thus Descartes, quote, makes the abolition of all determinations the first condition of philosophy, close quote. Accordingly, thought as such is not merely an aspect of philosophy, but its foundational subject, and it is in this respect that Hegel's phenomenology of mind is the foundational science. In his lectures on the history of philosophy, Hegel turns to Newton admiringly, but with what is finally a devastating criticism. He regards Newton's work as making it possible for Locke's philosophy to become nearly official. The commitment to perceptual modes of knowledge and the shunning of deeper metaphysical considerations are products of this very mode of thinking. What then of Newtonian science and the enterprises that would mimic it? Here is Hegel's judgment. Referring to Newton, he says, quote, "Physics, beware of metaphysics," was his maxim, which signifies science, beware of thought. And all the physical sciences, even to the present day, have, following in his wake, faithfully observed this precept, inasmuch as they have not entered upon an investigation of their conceptions, or thought about thought. Physics can, however, effect nothing without thought. Regarding matters as he did, Newton derived his conclusions from his experiences. And in physics and the theory of color vision, he made bad observations and drew worse conclusions, close quote. Well, this is quite a judgment. One wonders how we ever got to the moon. But there is a deeper lesson in the judgment, even if the Newtonian science proved itself to be adequate in many ways. And the deeper lesson is that a thoughtless application of thought itself may confuse us into believing we have witnessed reality as such, when in fact we've merely recovered the product of a method. If you assume that the ultimate reality is corpuscular, you will then develop a set of methods designed to deal with what? Corpuscles. And guess what you'll discover if you do that? Corpuscles. And what will you then conclude? Aha, I said the whole thing was corpuscular, and now I've proved it. Now, against this, Hegel would contend that the true is the whole, and that there are no parts of truth. The other ingredient that Hegel finds sorely wanting in science is explanation. Ironically, science doesn't actually explain anything, he insists. Now, suppose we take one of the classic laws of physics, F equals ma. To impart an acceleration to an object, a force must be applied that is proportional to the mass of the object. Force equals mass times acceleration. But suppose we had a high school student or a youngster who had not been taught anything in physics at all. And we went to the blackboard, and instead of writing F equals ma, we wrote F equals 5m plus 3.2a. Would the student protest? No, keep taking notes. In fact, none of the laws of physics makes any more sense than some radically different form of the law. The laws of physics simply describe what is. It turns out that if you make accurate and repeated measurements, the equation F equals ma is the one that keeps coming up. The world could have been constituted in such a way that F would have equaled something other than ma. Now, what Hegel is getting at when he says that the scientific laws produced by mechanistic science don't really explain things, well, these laws don't tell us why things are the way they are. What's the point of all this precision and lawfulness? There's got to be a story behind this, and it surely isn't revealed simply by the equation. The scientific community might sit back in a rather arrogant way and say, well, look, that's the way it is. But the question returns, why is that the way it is? Why isn't it some other way? To include Hegel within the tradition of Romanticism or German Romantic idealism requires that we turn again to Johann Fichte, whose Science of Knowledge was published in 1797. Fichte is a pivotal figure in the history of philosophy. Indeed, that famous Hegelian triad of thesis, antithesis, synthesis is actually Fichte's contribution, and it's rarely employed by Hegel himself. At this point, all that needs to be said of Fichte is that he recognized in Kant's epistemology a fundamental conflict. If there is some sort of conceptual or logical barrier between reality as it is and reality as it is perceived, between the noumenal and the phenomenal, a choice must be made by philosophy. Either there must be a commitment to bypass mind as such in every possible way, or accept that it is mind as such that is the worthy object of attention. Fichte's argument is that the ultimate reality is that of idea, the starting point of philosophy then being the transcendental ego. Against the Kantian thesis that the mind cannot know anything except under the forms of appearance, and never as the entity is in itself, Fichte will counter that the mind knows itself noumenally, and not as appearance. Now we might say at this point, enter Hegel. What we ought to be looking for is not merely those causal connections revealed in scientific laws. Rather, we should be looking for the reason behind the laws, for reality is rational. There is a profound difference between explanations based on causes and explanations based on reasons. And it's useful here to summarize the differences. Aristotle had argued that genuinely scientific knowledge, episteme, requires a complete causal account. But he then went on to note that a complete causal account must include the that for the sake of which, the end or purpose or telos, for the sake of which the other causal modalities operated. So it is the final cause, the that for the sake of which, that is the reason why the event or object came about. Now, one way to illustrate this is within the context of adjudication. Suppose we have someone brought before the bar of justice for having mortally wounded another. Smith is charged with shooting Jones. Now, the answer to the question, why did Jones die, can take a variety of forms. We might say with the poets, dust thou art, to dust returneth. Or we might turn to page 1 of the logic textbook and read, all men are mortal, Jones is a man, necessarily Jones is mortal. And now we have proof of it. But of course, what the court will say, what the jury will say, is that this syllogism is true indifferently across all human beings. This doesn't identify what it was that brought about Jones's death. Well, we might next hear from the expert pathologist who tells us that the offending bullet severed the basilar artery or something like that, the brain was denied blood supply, and so forth, and Jones died. Now here's an account in terms of the efficient cause. Then all of a sudden, maybe out of desperation, Smith stands up and says, look, I shot him. He was carrying on with my wife and I killed him, close quote. Well, now the jury breathes a sigh of relief. Those in attendance will breathe a sigh of relief. So will the judge. There is now an answer to the question. The event was brought about because there actually was a reason behind it. This explanation is entirely different from those based on biology or mortality or poetry. In a nutshell, Hegel's thesis is that there is no sufficient concept without a comprehension of the reason for the object, establishing that inner necessity that accounts fully for its reality. Hegel applies this to human history itself. There is a distinct evolutionary perspective in Romanticism. Romanticism contains nothing if not the idea of struggle. The idea of struggle that produces newer and different, ultimately better, more developed forms through the Sturm und Drang. Now, a word about this Sturm und Drang, this storm and stress, which is at the heart of Romanticism. The phrase appears in the title of a 1776 play by von Klinger, but its essence had already been revealed in Goethe's 1774 The Sorrows of Young Werther, a tragic tale of young and unrequited love leading to suicide. The story produced a small epidemic of suicide attempts. At the center of the idea is the problem of life itself, accommodating to the storms and stresses of existence. It's at its worst in youth, when all vital energy seeks to express itself, when the authentic and creative thought bursts forth as genius. But always is the struggle, and each victory is followed by yet another struggle. History is the Sturm und Drang writ large. And what does it reveal? Suppose we were to conduct an anthropological study of human communities over the full course of human life on Earth. Well, we find in the earliest tiny tribal enclaves attempts to scrape a living out of the rocky soil. Often members are found running fast from predators. Others wait in hiding for something edible. This is a very limited sort of life, but out of the struggles in that life will evolve an ever more resourceful kind of humanity. And out of that will evolve a more settled human community. And out of that might evolve certain social forms and practices. And out of those will evolve, particularly with literacy, a more defined and abstract level of the rule of law, etc., etc. Now Hegel would ask, are we to assume that this is just some sort of accidental set of occurrences? Instead, doesn't this patently point to a plan or scheme of some kind? These aren't developments that take place in a haphazard way. They are progressive developments of an evolutionary nature. It's out of the struggle itself that something gets resolved. And it is in the resolution that we find life lived now on a higher plane. There is reason in human history, says Hegel. In fact, one of Hegel's most accessible works is the essay titled Reason in History. In that work, which is a collection of Hegel's lectures on philosophy of history, the conclusion Hegel reaches is that history is but the creation of, it is a creation by reason, guiding the affairs of the world. Through its own self-sufficiency, reason is unconstrained by any merely physical or causal law. It's the source of its own laws, you can hear a bit of Kant here, which it then realizes through human history. This is not a reworking of Aristotle, though the Aristotelian dimensions of this are not difficult to discern. But Hegel makes rather more of it. Aristotle did say that if the art of shipbuilding were in the wood, we would have ships by nature. But with Hegel, the idea is enlarged. Nor will we get the progressive refinement and rationality of human life except as a result of something that realizes itself thereby. There is something that is working itself through human history. And Hegel is satisfied that that something is ontologically real, that indeed in the absence of that ontologically real something, you could not have such an evolutionary and progressive course. Hegel refers to it with more than one term, typically as the absolute. And of course that's capital A. Sometimes he refers to it as the absolute idea. In his Science of Logic, he defines it this way, quote, "The absolute idea is the identity of the theoretical and practical idea, the rational notion that in its reality meets only with itself. All else is error, confusion, opinion, endeavor, caprice, and transitoriness. The absolute idea alone is being, imperishable, life, self-knowing, truth, and is all truth." Close quote. Now, William James, that great phrase maker, James will say at one point that when the Hegelians refer to the absolute idea, they sound like they're going up in a balloon. Well, James's philosophy is quintessentially pragmatic, and as I will show in later lectures, quintessentially American. And of course, it must be at war with this Hegelian kind of thinking. But the romantic idealism of the German intellectual world is committed to a quite brave rejection of all mechanistic sciences that never really do get around to addressing reality as in fact we find it. Now, the absolute, in this Hegelian sense, the absolute expresses itself in a variety of ways. And in Hegel's time, he is satisfied that the fullest expression of it is in the ordered state itself. In fact, in a passage that I should say in the wake of two world wars taking place in our own century, shall I say, this is a phrase that has a kind of chilling property to it. Don't blame Hegel for what a later history engages in. But when Hegel reflects on the state, when he sees in the state the au courant expression of the absolute in human history, and says of the state that it is, quote, the march of God in the world, close quote. Well, now, you might be thinking, goodness gracious, is this the sort of state hegemony that the Nazis were claiming for themselves, the march of God in the world? Is this not what they claimed for the state, the duty to realize a rational plan for the world and create a regime that would last a millennium? Now, more than one scholar has pointed out that you can derive any number of bad things by way of what are sometimes called the Hegelians of the right. The Hegelians of the right will be the ones who, in Marx's day, believed, and thereafter believed, that the power of the state should be obeyed, that fidelity to the laws of the state is the first obligation of citizenship. And the Hegelians of the left, some arriving as Marxists, will find in the same works of Hegel an understanding of freedom that requires the dissolution of the state and the installation of rule by the proletarian class. Hegel might have been clearer by saving us from two world wars and a long cold one. Much of Romantic idealism, however, was devoted to moral issues of the sort generated by these various conceptions of authority and responsibility to it. For these moral issues arise directly from freedom and from the free play of concepts. Kant, recall, had insisted that there's only one morally good thing in the universe. The only thing in the universe that's unequivocally good is the good will. And Kant had grounded morality ultimately in what we would be disposed to bring about if we could bring about anything we could in our most rational moments. Hegel is not satisfied with this. He believes that it leaves much too much room for what is arbitrary, even for what is wicked. He grants to conscience a certain moral authority, but this is incomplete, for the individual himself is incomplete. Rather, one's identity is shaped and sustained through political and social associations. Thus does social ethics reach far more closely to an ideal than would the merely individual nature of values. So emphasis now is going to be not on the freedom of the individual, but on the duties of the individual. Where the state itself reflects the general will, this is a key notion in Rousseau's theory of the social contract, where the state expresses the general will, there is a complete duty to the state. In his philosophy of right, Hegel leaves little doubt as to his position on just this matter. Quote, the state is the realization of the ethical idea. The true state is the ethical whole and the realization of freedom. The state is the march of God through the world. The state is an organism. The state is the world which the Spirit has made for itself. Close quote. Now, to trace this collectivization of consciousness in Hegel's political philosophy, Fichte again becomes an authoritative voice. In his History of Philosophy, Hegel says this about Fichte, that, quote, with Fichtean philosophy, a revolution took place in Germany. Now, recall three critiques: the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, the critique of judgment. Those were Kant's. Then, anonymously, Fichte, whose dates are 1762 to 1814, published a work entitled An Attempt at a Critique of All Revelation in 1792. He was just 30 years old. It was not only Kantian in tone and character, it struck many as being Kantian in its philosophical power and insight, and indeed many people began to attribute it to Kant himself. So Kant had to write publicly that this fine treatise was not his, but was written by this young philosopher Fichte. Well, of course, if at that time in Germany you wanted to become a household name, just be thought of as someone whose work is of such a nature that you might have thought Kant was the author. Fichte was a well-known champion of liberal movements. Early on, he published, again anonymously, a controversial essay titled "Reclamation of the Freedom of Thought from the Princes of Europe who have oppressed it until now," close quote. At the age of 31, he was appointed to the chair of philosophy at the prestigious University at Jena, later becoming the rector of the new University of Berlin in 1811. This at a time when Napoleon's troops were occupying all of Prussia, and when indeed German-speaking people were tripping over themselves to affect the manner of the French, even to learn French, to adopt French modes of dress, etc. Fichte then delivered a lecture which ultimately would cast him by post-World War II lights as the wrong sort of chap. He delivered an address, a lecture to the German people in 1807, his Reden an die deutsche Nation. This address did much to excite German nationalism and to preserve German cultural forms in the face of formidable challenges. Fichte is important philosophically as the architect for that logic, that kind of Hegelian ontological logic that features the famous dialectical triad thesis, antithesis, synthesis, progress through conflict, reality arising from opposing tendencies. Freedom itself, the idea of freedom, arises from just such a dialectic of conflict. Man may be born free, but one couldn't know this until the first occasion on which that freedom is resisted and oppressed by another. It is in the attempt to constrain your freedom that the world presents you with the possibility now of being conscious of your freedom. So it's through the dialectic of a free being facing oppressive and coercive forces that the idea of freedom dawns, thereupon directing us as moral beings. But freedom is not the last word. In his Characteristics of the Present Age, Fichte traces the stages of moral development of the entire human race, culminating in our own self-conscious awareness of our freedom. But we have become by now so in awe of this freedom that we exercise it for its own sake. Freedom now has no purpose beyond its almost arrogant, hubristic exercise on Fichte's account. Thus intoxicated, man enters into what Fichte calls, quote, the stage of perfected sinfulness. And what he means by perfected sinfulness is acting for the sheer sake of expressing freedom against any and all grounds of constraint, opposition, or coercion. Fichte insists that this is a stage that must evolve into something higher, where freedom is understood instrumentally. It's to become the means by which to produce what is finally good in the world, and for all. Only when one abandons individuality, which is materiality itself, can there be an eternal life. As an individual entity, you're a material particular entity, and it is in abandoning that and surrendering oneself to the good of the whole that the possibility of a life that transcends mere materiality becomes possible. So the dialectical ontology defended by Fichte then enters Hegel's metaphysics at every point. It is by way of the dialectic that any this arises from all that is not this. Take a pair of spectacles and you might say, well, this is a particular thing. In traditional logic, you distinguish between particulars and universals. But how do you get a particular thing? The only way these could be a pair of spectacles is by there not being anything else, not being everything else. The only way there can be a this is in virtue of its not being everything else. So each particular is in its own right a universal. And this puts Hegel into the idea that there may be particulars which in their very nature instantiate cosmically important universals. There are three domains in which this happens on Hegel's account. The domain of philosophy, the logical domain I just described, in which the ontological possibility of the individual is only in virtue of the universal, to which it stands in dialectical relation. There is the artistic genius, who produces in the singular particular work the instantiation of the universally beautiful. And so in the domain of aesthetics as well as in the domain of philosophy, and in the domain of aesthetics, the dialectic operates in such a way that individual instances give rise to the universals themselves. And it's finally in religion. Hegel was persuaded that the religion that succeeds most fully is Christianity, and this chiefly because of the ethics instantiated by the individual man Jesus, who is universalized as the Christ. You can see the effect Hegelian philosophy and metaphysics would have on Christian philosophy and philosophy of religion at large. Hegelian influences abroad in the world today and powerfully influential.